When a homeless man lent his only coat to a stranger, he never imagined a billionaire would walk into his life and change everything. In a world where the homeless are often invisible, this selfless gesture sparked a chain of events that would transform both their lives forever. What happened next defies everything we think we know about second chances and human connection. James had been invisible for 3 years, 2 months, and 17 days. Not literally, of course, but in the way society had trained itself to look past people like him, huddled in doorways, seeking shelter beneath underpasses, or shuffling along with everything they owned in a shopping cart. At 42, James hadn't planned on homelessness. But life has a cruel way of compounding disasters. First the layoff, then the medical bills, followed by the eviction. But what broke James wasn't losing his home. It was losing his identity in other people's eyes. Each morning, thousands would walk past him, their gazes sliding off him like rainwater off a window. Some days, he'd count how many people would actually look him in the eye. His record was 7. 7 people in a single day who acknowledged his humanity. Despite everything, James maintained an unshakable code. Treat others with dignity, share what little you have, and never surrender your compassion. What he didn't know was that this code would be tested on the coldest night of the year, when a single decision would set in motion events beyond his imagination. The temperature had plummeted to 15 degrees by sunset, and the wind cutting through downtown made it feel even colder. Weather forecasters had warned about this Arctic blast for days, but warnings meant little when you had nowhere to escape the elements. James huddled deeper into his coat, a weathered Army surplus parka he'd received from a church donation last winter. It wasn't stylish, with its faded olive color and frayed cuffs, but the thick insulation and hood had kept him alive through the worst nights when the shelters were full and the city seemed to freeze solid. Tonight promised to be the coldest yet. The streets had emptied earlier than usual as people hurried home to warmth and safety. Even the usual evening crowd, the restaurant goers, the theater attendees, the late working professionals, had thinned considerably, leaving an eerie quiet broken only by the howl of wind tunneling between skyscrapers. James had claimed his usual doorway by 6 o'clock, a recessed entrance to a financial services office building that offered some protection from the wind. He'd learned through bitter experience which spots provided the best shelter from the elements. This particular doorway had a security camera above it, which meant police were less likely to roust him in the middle of the night. And the overhang kept the worst of the snow and rain at bay. Small mercies. But in his world, these details made the difference between suffering and survival. He had just settled in, arranging his few possessions, a backpack containing spare socks, a toothbrush, and a dog-eared paperback, when he noticed a young man across the street. The stranger wore only a light suit jacket over what appeared to be an expensive button-down shirt and slacks. He was shivering violently as he paced back and forth beneath a streetlight, repeatedly checking his phone with increasingly frantic movements. James recognized the look of someone stranded, waiting for a ride that wasn't coming. After 20 minutes of watching the man grow increasingly distressed, James noticed his lips had turned an alarming shade of blue. The young man's ears were bright red, and he had stopped pacing, now simply hugging himself and stamping his feet in designer shoes completely unsuited for the weather. "You're going to freeze to death out here," James called out, surprising himself. He rarely initiated conversations with strangers, having learned that invisibility was often safer than engagement in a world that viewed the homeless with suspicion and contempt. The man looked up, startled that someone had addressed him. His eyes took a moment to locate James in the shadows of the doorway. "My Uber canceled," he explained, his voice shaking from cold. And now, The apps crashed completely. He glanced helplessly at his phone. I've been trying to get another car for almost half an hour. His teeth chattered between words. I'm Michael, by the way. James. He hesitated, feeling the weight of his decision before he even made it. The coat was his only real protection against the elements. Without it, the night would be dangerous, possibly deadly. The temperature was still dropping, and the forecast called for it to reach single digits by midnight. But the young man clearly wasn't prepared for this weather, and might not last another hour without proper protection. Take my coat, James said finally, already unzipping it. The cold air immediately bit through his thin sweater underneath, a stark reminder of what he was giving away. What? No, I couldn't possibly. Michael began to protest, looking genuinely uncomfortable with the offer. I've got layers, James lied, fighting to keep his voice steady as the cold already began seeping into his bones. And I know how to stay warm out here. You don't. He held out the parka. Just take it. Please. Michael's resistance crumbled in the face of the biting cold and the genuine concern in James's voice. Thank you. I don't know what to say. I'll find a way to return it somehow. Don't worry about it, James said, already feeling the cold penetrating deeper as Michael gratefully put on the coat. It was too big for the younger man's slender frame, but the relief on his face was immediate. Michael reached for his wallet. Let me at least give you something. James shook his head firmly. No, I don't want your money. And he meant it. Something about taking payment would have diminished what he'd done, turned a human gesture into a transaction. Just be safe and get home. I don't understand, Michael said, his breath visible in the freezing air. Why would you do this for a complete stranger? James thought about it for a moment. Because someone once did something similar for me when I still had a home to go to. He didn't elaborate on the memory, a roadside assistance from a passing truck driver when his car broke down during a snowstorm years ago. Sometimes we just need to look out for each other. Michael nodded, visibly moved. I won't forget this. He pulled the coat tighter around himself as his phone suddenly chimed. My ride's finally coming. Are you sure? Go, James insisted. I'll be fine. As he watched Michael hurry away toward the main avenue where a car had pulled up, James tucked himself tighter into the doorway, pulling a flattened cardboard box around his shoulders. He arranged his backpack as a makeshift pillow and wrapped his arms around his torso, trying to conserve what little body heat remained. The night stretched before him like an endless frozen sea, each hour promising to be more brutal than the last. His fingers were already growing numb, and he tucked them into his armpits, knowing frostbite was a real possibility. He'd seen others lose fingers and toes to the winter cold. Yet somewhere deep inside, a warmth persisted, the kind that comes from knowing you've done the right thing, even when it costs you everything. That warmth wouldn't keep his body from suffering, but it kept something equally important intact: his humanity. As the night deepened and the city lights reflected off patches of ice forming on the sidewalk, James drifted in and out of a fitful sleep, waking frequently to move his limbs and prevent the cold from settling too deeply into his body. He thought about the shelters across town, all likely filled to capacity on a night like this. He thought about the community center that sometimes opened its doors during extreme weather, but it was miles away, too far to walk in these conditions without proper clothing. What James couldn't possibly know as he fought his private battle against the elements was that his selfless act had been witnessed by someone else, someone whose attention would change the course of his life forever. from the tinted window of a luxury car idling at the curb. Calculating eyes had observed the entire exchange, noting with interest the man who would give away his only protection on the coldest night of the year. Alexander Reed watched the exchange from the heated comfort of his Bentley, parked discreetly across the street. At 58, with salt and pepper hair and piercing gray eyes that missed nothing, Reed had built an empire worth billions through ruthless efficiency and an uncanny ability to evaluate human character. His company, Reed Enterprises, had holdings in everything from real estate to technology, and his name appeared regularly on lists of the most influential people in the country. Tonight, he'd been leaving a late board meeting when his driver had pulled over to take a call, positioning the car with a clear view of the homeless man's doorway. "Did you see that, Morris?" Reed asked his driver, his breath fogging the window slightly as he leaned forward. He rarely showed such interest in street-level happenings, preferring to view the world from the penthouse perspective. "Yes, sir," Morris replied, his eyes meeting Reed's in the rearview mirror. Morris had been Reed's driver for 15 years and knew his employer's moods and interests better than most. Quite something. Reed tapped his fingers thoughtfully against the leather armrest, a habit he'd developed during tense negotiations. The gold signet ring on his right hand caught the light from a nearby street lamp. He'd built his fortune by recognizing patterns others missed, by seeing value where others saw nothing. And something about this interaction had triggered his finely tuned instincts that had rarely led him astray. "Circle the block," he instructed. "I want another look." Morris nodded and eased the luxury vehicle back into the sparse traffic. Reed used the brief interlude to check his messages. 3 emails from his Tokyo office, a text from his daughter in London, and a calendar reminder about tomorrow's foundation meeting. He dismissed them all with practiced efficiency, his mind still occupied with the scene he'd witnessed. When they returned, the homeless man was huddled in the doorway, visibly shivering without his coat. Reed watched him for several long moments, noting the careful organization of his meager possessions, the way he'd positioned himself to maximize protection from the wind while maintaining sight lines to the street. Small details that spoke of intelligence and adaptability. Despite his circumstances, there was a dignity in the man's bearing, a conscious resistance to the dehumanizing effects of his situation. "Stop the car," Reed said suddenly, his decision made. "Sir?" Morris questioned, surprise evident in his voice. In 15 years of employment, he'd never known his boss to engage with homeless individuals. Alexander Reed's charitable giving was substantial, but always carefully managed through foundations and formal channels, with teams of professionals evaluating worthiness and impact metrics. "I said stop the car, Morris." Reed's tone left no room for discussion. It was the same voice that had silenced boardrooms and intimidated business rivals. As the vehicle came to a smooth halt, Reed reached for the door handle, then paused. "Keep the engine running. This won't take long." He checked his watch. An understated Patek Philippe that had cost more than most people's annual salary, and calculated that he could spare 15 minutes before his next appointment. The bitter cold hit him like a physical blow as he stepped onto the sidewalk. Even in his custom-tailored wool overcoat, cashmere scarf, and leather gloves, the chill cut deep. He crossed the street with purposeful strides, his Italian leather shoes crunching on patches of ice. The sound of his approach was distinct, the confident rhythm of a man accustomed to walking into any room as its most important occupant. James looked up as the well-dressed man approached, wariness immediately replacing exhaustion in his eyes. Experience had taught him that unexpected attention rarely brought good news. In his world, interest from someone of obvious wealth usually meant being asked to move along, to make himself invisible for the comfort of others. "Good evening," Reed said, stopping a respectful distance away. Up close, he could see that despite the man's unkempt appearance, his eyes were clear and intelligent. There was no sign of the substance abuse issues Reed had half expected to find. "Evening," James replied cautiously, his voice raspy from the cold. He straightened slightly, an instinctive attempt to maintain dignity in the face of what he assumed would be another humiliation. "I saw what you did for that young man." Reed's voice was deep and measured, carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. "May I ask your name?" "James. James Connor." He offered nothing more, no explanation or backstory, just the essential information requested. "Mr. Connor, I'm Alexander Reed." He paused, noting with interest that James showed no reaction to his name, despite it being featured regularly in business publications and charity gala photos. Either James didn't follow business news, understandable given his circumstances, or he was uncommonly skilled at masking his reactions. Both possibilities intrigued Reed further. "What you did was remarkable," Reed continued, gesturing subtly toward the direction Michael had disappeared. James shifted uncomfortably under the scrutiny. Anyone would have done the same. "No," Reed said firmly, the certainty in his voice absolute. "They wouldn't. I've observed enough of humanity to know that with certainty." His tone carried the weight of countless boardroom battles and high-stakes negotiations where he'd witnessed human nature at its most self-serving. "You gave away your only protection on what might be the deadliest night of winter. He needed it more than me," James said simply, as if the calculation had been obvious. Reed nodded slowly, as if confirming something to himself. In his world of complex motivations and hidden agendas, such straightforward altruism was vanishingly rare. "Mr. Connor, I have a proposition for you. I own the Alexander Hotel 6 blocks from here. I'd like to offer you a room for the night, no strings attached." James's expression hardened, a flash of pride cutting through his exhaustion. "I don't need charity." "This isn't charity," Reed countered smoothly, having anticipated this reaction. "Consider it payment for a service." "What service?" James's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "You've shown me something I rarely see in my world. Genuine selflessness. That has value to me." Reed reached into his coat and produced a business card, offering it to James. The card was simple but elegant, heavy cream stock with his name and contact information embossed in dark blue. One night, a hot meal, a chance to warm up. Nothing more is expected. James stared at the card, conflict evident in his face. Pride warred with the very real danger of his situation. The temperature had dropped another 5 degrees since nightfall, and his hands were already showing the alarming redness that precedes frostbite. "Why?" he asked finally, making no move to take the card. "Why me?" Reed considered the question carefully. He could have offered platitudes about compassion or social responsibility, but something told him this man would see through such convenient explanations. "Let's just say I recognize potential when I see it, and I believe in investing in potential." The word investing hung between them, loaded with implications neither man fully articulated. Reed had built his fortune by identifying undervalued assets before others recognized their worth. Was that what he was doing now? Seeing something in James Connor that others had overlooked? After a long moment, James reached out and took the card. His fingers were already alarmingly red from the cold, the nails showing a bluish tinge that concerned Reed more than he let show. The hotel staff will be expecting you, Reed said, already mentally composing the text he would send to his hotel manager as soon as he returned to his car. Ask for Marcus at the service entrance. He'll handle everything discreetly. Reed understood that pride was often the last possession of those who had lost everything else, and he had no desire to subject James to the indignity of walking through the grand lobby in his current state. James nodded, still suspicious, but unable to completely dismiss what might be his only chance to survive the night. The cardboard he'd been using for insulation was already damp from the ground, and his thin sweater offered almost no protection against the plummeting temperatures. "Thank you," he said finally, the words coming with obvious difficulty. Reed gave a slight nod before turning to leave. He'd taken only a few steps when James called after him. "Mr. Reed, this isn't some kind of game, is it?" The question contained layers of meaning. Was this a cruel joke? A setup? A moment of whimsical charity that would evaporate by morning? Reed turned back, his expression inscrutable. In the harsh streetlight, his features seemed carved from stone, revealing nothing of his inner thoughts. "Mr. Connor, I assure you, I never play games with investments I consider worthwhile." The ambiguity of the response wasn't lost on either man. Reed hadn't denied that James was, in some sense, an investment. But he had implied that the investment was serious, not capricious. As Reed returned to his waiting car, he felt a curious satisfaction. In the morning, he would make some calls, set certain things in motion. For now, he had identified something rare, a man with nothing who still found something to give. In Reed's experience, such people were either fools or possessed of an inner strength that could move mountains if properly directed. "Back to the residence, Morris," he instructed as he settled into the leather seat, immediately reaching for his phone to send instructions to his hotel manager. "Yes, sir." Morris pulled away from the curb, glancing in the rearview mirror. "If I may ask, sir, what was that about?" Morris had been with Reed long enough to occasionally venture such personal questions. Their relationship, while still firmly employer-employee, had developed a certain comfortable familiarity over the years. Reed watched the city lights reflect off the polished wood of the car's interior as he composed a text message. "Do you remember how we met, Morris?" "Of course, sir. You gave me a chance when no one else would." Morris had been an ex-convict with few prospects when Reed had hired him, a decision that had raised eyebrows among Reed's security team. "Exactly." Reed smiled slightly, sending the message and setting his phone aside. Sometimes the most valuable assets are the ones others have written off completely. Morris nodded, understanding the parallel Reed was drawing. "And sometimes those assets provide the greatest returns," he added, knowing his own story was proof of the concept. "Precisely." Reed turned his attention to the passing cityscape, his mind already working through possibilities and contingencies. "Have Diane clear my schedule for breakfast tomorrow. I may need that time." "Yes, sir." Morris made a mental note to contact Reed's personal assistant as soon as they reached the residence. As the Bentley glided through the frozen city streets, James Connor stood in the doorway, staring at the embossed business card in his hand. The name meant nothing to him, but the quality of the card, the man's bearing, and the casual mention of owning a hotel all spoke of significant wealth and power. After a long moment of deliberation, he gathered his few possessions and began the slow, painful walk toward the address on the card, unaware that his life had just changed irrevocably. The 6-block journey was excruciating. Without his coat, the wind cut through his thin layers like knives, and his extremities quickly began to lose sensation. Twice he had to stop and shelter in doorways, stamping his feet and rubbing his hands together to restore circulation. By the time the Alexander Hotel's imposing facade came into view, James was walking with the stiff, careful gait of someone fighting both cold and pain. The Alexander was one of the city's premier luxury hotels, 28 stories of gleaming glass and stone, with a reputation for impeccable service and absolute discretion. Its clientele included celebrities, foreign dignitaries, and business elites who valued privacy above all else. James approached not the grand entrance with its uniformed doormen and polished brass revolving doors, but the more modest service entrance on the side street, as instructed. A security camera tracked his approach, and by the time he reached the door, a man in a crisp black suit was waiting for him. The man's expression betrayed no surprise or judgment at James's appearance, only professional courtesy. "Mr. Connor?" he inquired. James nodded, too cold now for words. "I'm Marcus. Mr. Reed called ahead. Please come with me." The sudden warmth of the building's interior was almost painful against James's frozen skin. Marcus led him through service corridors, bypassing the public areas of the hotel, and into a private elevator that required a key card to operate. They rode in silence to the 26th floor, where Marcus escorted him to a door at the end of a hushed corridor. "This is one of our executive suites," Marcus explained, opening the door to reveal a spacious room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. "The bathroom is through there, with fresh towels and toiletries. The closet contains robes and some basic clothing that should fit you. Room service is available 24 hours. Just dial 0 on the phone. Is there anything else you need right now?" James stood motionless, overwhelmed by the sudden transition from freezing doorway to luxury suite. The room was larger than the apartment he'd lost 3 years ago. "No," he managed finally. "This is more than enough." Marcus nodded. "Mr. Reed has instructed that you're to be given complete privacy and whatever you require for your comfort. He also asked me to inform you that he would like to meet with you tomorrow morning at 8:30, if that's convenient for you. Breakfast will be served here." "He wants to meet again?" James asked, surprised. "Yes, sir. He was quite specific about it." Marcus handed him a key card. "This will operate the elevator and your door. If you need anything at all, please don't hesitate to call the front desk." After Marcus left, James stood in the center of the room, still clutching his backpack, feeling profoundly out of place. The carpet beneath his feet was thicker than the mattress he'd slept on at his last shelter stay. The silence was absolute. No traffic noise, no voices, none of the constant soundtrack of street life he'd grown accustomed to. Slowly, he set down his backpack and moved to the bathroom, where he caught sight of himself in the mirror for the first time in weeks. The face that stared back was almost unrecognizable. Gaunt, weathered, with a beard that had grown wild and eyes that had seen too much. Yet beneath the physical changes, something of his former self remained. A core identity that homelessness had altered, but not erased. As he turned on the shower and felt hot water for the first time in months, James tried to make sense of the evening's strange turn of events. Why had Alexander Reed singled him out? What did the man really want? And most importantly, what would happen tomorrow? Neither man could have predicted how their paths would continue to intersect, or how this chance encounter on the coldest night of the year would eventually affect the lives of thousands of others. For tonight, one had returned to his penthouse to plot a course neither had yet envisioned, while the other sank into clean sheets for the first time in years, his mind racing with questions about a future that had suddenly, inexplicably, opened before him. In the quiet darkness of the hotel room, as exhaustion finally overcame wariness, James drifted to sleep with one thought repeating in his mind. Nothing comes without a price. Tomorrow, he would discover what Alexander Reed expected in return for his unexpected generosity. James woke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar softness beneath him and the absence of street noise. Sunlight filtered through partially drawn curtains, illuminating the hotel's suite in a warm glow that seemed almost surreal after months of harsh fluorescent shelters and dim doorways. The digital clock on the nightstand read 7:15 a.m. Alexander Reed would arrive in just over an hour. James rose slowly, still marveling at the simple luxury of a real bed. His body ached less than it had in months, though his hands and feet still tingled uncomfortably. A reminder of how close he'd come to serious cold injury the night before. The bathroom beckoned with its gleaming fixtures and plush towels. James showered again, this time taking his time, letting the hot water soothe muscles that had grown accustomed to constant tension. He found a disposable razor and shaving cream among the toiletries and carefully removed his beard, revealing a face he barely recognized. Thinner, more weathered, but still recognizably himself. In the closet, he discovered what Marcus had meant by basic clothing, a selection of premium basics that would have cost several $100s in a department store. Dark jeans, a gray cashmere sweater, and a blue button-down shirt, all in his approximate size. There were even new underwear and socks still in their packaging. James dressed slowly, the unfamiliar sensation of clean, new clothing against his skin, both comforting and strange. At precisely 8 a.m., a gentle knock announced the arrival of breakfast. A young woman in the hotel uniform wheeled in a cart laden with covered dishes, a carafe of coffee, and a selection of juices. "Good morning, Mr. Connor," she said pleasantly, arranging the items on the small dining table by the window. "Mr. Reed called to say he'll be here at 8:30. Is there anything else you need before he arrives?" "No, thank you," James replied, still uncomfortable with being served. After she left, he approached the table cautiously, lifting the silver covers to reveal eggs, Benedict, fresh fruit, pastries, and smoked salmon. Enough food for 3 people. His stomach growled in response. Despite his apprehension about the upcoming meeting, James found himself eating with an appetite he hadn't experienced in months. At exactly 8:30, another knock came at the door. James took a deep breath, straightened his sweater, and went to answer it. Alexander Reed stood in the hallway, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than James had made in a month at his last job. In the daylight, Reed looked even more imposing, tall and lean, with the sharp features and penetrating gaze of a predator. Yet there was something almost approving in his expression as he noted James's transformed appearance. "Mr. Connor," Reed said with a slight nod. "May I come in?" "Of course." James stepped aside, suddenly acutely aware of the power imbalance between them. "Thank you for all of this." He gestured vaguely at the room, the clothes, the breakfast. Reed waved away the thanks as he entered. "You look better. How are you feeling?" "Much better," James admitted. "I wasn't sure I'd make it through last night without the coat." "That was my assessment as well," Reed said, his tone matter of fact. He moved to the window, gazing out at the city below. "Have you eaten?" "Yes, thank you." "Good." Reed turned back to face him. "Then perhaps we can discuss why I'm here." James nodded, bracing himself. Here it comes, he thought. The catch. "Please sit." Reed gestured to the small seating area. Once they were both seated, he continued. "Mr. Connor, I make it a point to understand the people I deal with. So before we proceed, I'd like to know more about you." James hesitated. "What do you want to know? How did you end up on the street?" The directness of the question caught James off guard. Most people either avoided the subject entirely or approached it with uncomfortable euphemisms. "It's not a unique story," he said finally. "I was an architectural draftsman for a mid-sized firm, had an apartment, a girlfriend, a life. Then the recession hit. The firm downsized, and I was among the last hired, first fired. I found some freelance work, but not enough. Fell behind on rent. My girlfriend moved on. I stayed with friends until I'd exhausted their patience." He shrugged. "You can only couch surf for so long before you run out of couches." Reed listened intently, his expression revealing nothing. "And family?" "My parents died years ago. Car accident. I have a sister in Seattle, but we're not close. Haven't spoken in years." James paused. "Look, Mr. Reed, I appreciate what you did last night, but I'm not comfortable being studied like this." Reed nodded. "Fair enough. Then let me be direct about why I'm here." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm offering you a job, Mr. Connor." Of all the things James had expected, demands, conditions, perhaps a request for some questionable service, this was not on the list. "A job?" he repeated incredulously. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," Reed countered. "I know you're intelligent, resourceful, and capable of extraordinary selflessness under pressure. I know you have professional training that could be valuable. And most importantly, I know you have nothing to lose and everything to gain." James's eyes narrowed. "What kind of job?" "To start, an administrative position at my foundation. The Reed Foundation funds various initiatives focused on urban poverty, education, and housing. The role would involve coordinating with grant recipients, organizing site visits, and providing perspective on the Foundation's initiatives. The position comes with a salary of $65,000 annually, health benefits, and an apartment in a building I own near the Foundation offices." James stared at him, searching for the hidden angle. The offer was too good, too convenient. "Why me? You could hire anyone with actual experience for that position." "Experience can be acquired. Character cannot." Reed's gaze was unwavering. "What I witnessed last night was a man with nothing giving away his only protection to help a stranger. That kind of character is rare, Mr. Connor, and it's precisely what my foundation needs. Someone who truly understands the issues we're trying to address, not just academically, but personally. And if I say no, then you walk away. The clothes are yours to keep. I'll have Marcus arrange a week's stay at a more modest hotel to give you time to consider other options. No obligations." James stood and walked to the window, trying to process the surreal turn his life had taken in less than 24 hours. From nearly freezing to death to being offered a life-changing opportunity by a billionaire who'd witnessed a single act of kindness. "What's the catch, Mr. Reed?" he asked finally, turning back to face his benefactor. "There's always a catch." Reed smiled slightly, the first real expression James had seen on his face. "Perceptive. Yes, there is a condition." He stood as well, closing the distance between them. "Complete honesty, Mr. Connor. I expect you to tell me when our initiatives are missing the mark, when we're being self-congratulatory rather than effective, when we're failing to understand the real issues. I don't need another yes man. I need someone who has lived the problems we're trying to solve." James considered this. "And if my honest opinion contradicts yours? Then I expect you to stand your ground and make your case." Reed's tone was firm. I didn't build my company by surrounding myself with sycophants, Mr. Connor. I built it by finding people who would tell me the truth, even when I didn't want to hear it. A long silence stretched between them as James weighed the offer. It seemed too perfect, too convenient. Like a modern fairy tale where the benevolent king rescues the worthy pauper. Yet the alternative was to return to the streets, to the daily struggle for survival that had consumed his life for the past 3 years. "When would I start?" he asked finally. "Monday," Reed replied. "That gives you 3 days to settle into the apartment and prepare. The foundation offices are in the same building, so your commute will be an elevator ride. And if it doesn't work out, then we part ways professionally. But the apartment remains yours for 6 months, giving you time to find another position." Reed extended his hand. "Do we have an agreement, Mr. Connor?" James looked at the offered hand, manicured, adorned with that signet ring, belonging to a world he'd never been part of. Then he looked at his own hand, still bearing the calluses and small scars of street life, but cleaner now, steadier. He took Reed's hand and shook it firmly. "We do, Mr. Reed." "Alexander, please. We'll be working closely together." "James, then." Reed nodded, apparently satisfied. "Marcus will help you with the paperwork and show you to the apartment this afternoon. I've taken the liberty of having some additional clothing delivered there, along with basic necessities. If there's anything specific you need, just let him know." As Reed moved toward the door, James called after him, echoing their exchange from the previous night. "Alexander, this still feels like some kind of game." Reed paused, his hand on the doorknob. "Not a game, James. An investment. And I expect a significant return." With that enigmatic statement, he was gone, leaving James alone with the remnants of breakfast and a future that had materialized out of nowhere. Later that afternoon, as Marcus escorted him to a sleek, one-bedroom apartment on the 15th floor of a downtown building, James still couldn't quite believe the turn his life had taken. The apartment was modern and minimalist, with floor-to-ceiling windows, new furniture, and a kitchen stocked with food. The closet contained enough clothing for a week, all in his size. "Mr. Reed asked me to give you this," Marcus said, handing him an envelope before leaving. Inside was a company credit card in James's name and a note in bold, angular handwriting. "For necessities. The first step toward rebuilding a life is to have the tools required. Use it wisely." A.R. James placed the card on the kitchen counter and walked slowly through the apartment, his apartment, at least for now. He ran his fingers along the smooth surfaces, tested the softness of the bed, stood in the shower just because he could. As night fell, he stood at the window, looking out at the city that had nearly killed him the night before. Somewhere out there, others were preparing for another night on the streets, huddling in doorways, seeking shelter wherever they could find it. The thought filled him with a complex mixture of guilt, relief, and determination. Whatever game Alexander Reed was playing, whatever return he expected from his investment, James resolved to use this unexpected opportunity not just for himself, but to somehow make a difference for those he'd left behind. If Reed wanted honesty, he would get it. Unvarnished truth about what it meant to fall through society's cracks, and what it would really take to help others climb back out. As he turned away from the window, his gaze fell on the business card Reed had given him the night before, now placed carefully on the nightstand. The embossed letters caught the light, a tangible reminder of how quickly life could change, for better or worse. Tomorrow, he would begin preparing for his new role. But tonight, for the first time in years, James Connor would sleep without fear, without cold, without hunger. And in that simple luxury lay a kind of redemption he had stopped believing was possible. Monday morning arrived with a clarity James hadn't experienced in years. The fog of constant survival, where each day blurred into the next in an endless struggle for food, warmth, and safety, had lifted, allowing him to think beyond immediate needs for the first time since losing his home. He dressed carefully in charcoal slacks and a navy button-down shirt from the wardrobe Reed had provided, studying his reflection in the bathroom mirror. The face looking back at him was still gaunt, but cleaner, more alert. 3 days of regular meals and proper sleep had already begun to erase the most visible marks of his time on the streets. The Reed Foundation occupied the top 3 floors of the building. Following Marcus's instructions, James took the elevator to the 28th floor, where a receptionist greeted him by name before he could introduce himself. "Good morning, Mr. Connor. Mr. Reed is expecting you in the conference room." She gestured toward a hallway of glass-walled offices. "Last door on the right." The Foundation's offices were modern and bright, with open workspaces and meeting rooms named after neighborhoods in the city. Staff members glanced up curiously as he passed, their expressions ranging from polite smiles to barely concealed skepticism. James wondered how much they knew about him and how he'd come to be hired. The conference room, labeled Riverside in sleek silver lettering, had floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. Alexander Reed stood at the head of a long table, reviewing documents with a slender woman in her 40s, whose sharp gaze assessed James immediately. "Ah, James. Right on time." Reed gestured for him to enter. "This is Elaine Winters, our foundation director. Elaine, James Connor." "Welcome to the team, Mr. Connor." Her handshake was firm, her smile professional but reserved. "Alexander has told me about your unique perspective." James nodded, reading between the lines. She knew he'd been homeless, and she had questions about his qualifications. "Thank you. I'm looking forward to learning about the Foundation's work." "Let's sit," Reed suggested, taking his place at the head of the table. James and Elaine sat on either side of him. "Before we introduce you to the rest of the staff, I want to give you an overview of our current initiatives." For the next hour, Reed and Elaine outlined the Foundation's major programs. A housing initiative that provided transitional apartments for families at risk of homelessness. An education grant program supporting schools in underserved neighborhoods. A workforce development project offering training and placement services. And a community health initiative focusing on preventative care in low-income areas. James listened attentively, impressed by the scope, but increasingly aware of gaps between the Foundation's intentions and the realities he'd experienced. "You have questions?" Reed observed during a pause in the presentation. It wasn't a question. "Several," James admitted. "But I'm still getting oriented." "Please," Reed gestured for him to continue. "Your perspective is precisely why you're here." James hesitated, glancing at Elaine, whose expression remained neutral but attentive. "The transitional housing program," he began carefully. "You mentioned it serves families with children under 18. What about single adults? They make up a significant portion of the homeless population, but have far fewer resources available to them." Elaine nodded. "We've focused on families because data shows earlier intervention prevents generational poverty cycles. But you're right. It's a gap in our programming." "And the Workforce Development Initiative," James continued, gaining confidence. "The requirement for participants to have a fixed address and ID documentation excludes many who need it most. When I lost my housing, my ID was stolen at a shelter within the first week. Replacing it without an address was nearly impossible." Reed leaned forward, clearly interested. What would you suggest? Partner with the DMV for an ID program specifically for those experiencing homelessness. Create a documentation pathway that acknowledges the realities of life without permanent housing. James paused. And consider where people are starting from. A 3-month training program is valuable, but someone living on the streets needs income today, not 3 months from now. A slight smile played at the corner of Reed's mouth. Elaine, I believe we've found our reality check. Elaine's reserve seemed to thaw slightly. We've discussed some of these issues in committee, but without first-hand experience. We've been guessing at solutions. She turned to James. Would you be willing to review our program criteria and suggest specific modifications? Of course, James agreed, surprised by her receptiveness. The meeting continued with a more detailed discussion of his role. He would initially serve as a program liaison, meeting with grant recipients and community partners while providing internal feedback on program design. His architectural background would be utilized for the housing initiative, reviewing plans for renovations and new construction. By noon, James had been introduced to the core team. About 20 professionals with backgrounds in nonprofit, management, social work, urban planning, and education. Most were welcoming, though a few seemed to reserve judgment. One program manager, a former social worker named Diane Chen, was particularly enthusiastic. We've needed someone like you, she told him during the lunch that followed. Someone who's been through it, not just studied it. The rest of us mean well, but there's a difference between empathy and experience. As the day progressed, James was given a desk in an open workspace, a laptop, and a stack of program documents to review. Reed had disappeared after lunch, returning to his corporate offices in another building, but not before scheduling a one-on-one meeting with James for Friday. First impressions? Reed had asked as he was leaving. You're doing good work, James replied honestly, but there are blind spots. Reed nodded, seemingly pleased with this assessment. That's why you're here. I'll see you Friday. By 5 o'clock, James's head was swimming with information, acronyms, and grant cycles. As the office began to empty, Elaine stopped by his desk. How are you settling in? She asked, her earlier reserve replaced with cautious collegiality. It's a lot to absorb, he admitted, but fascinating. She nodded. Alexander rarely makes impulsive decisions. When he told me he'd hired someone he'd met on the street, I was concerned. But after today, I better understand what he saw in you. She paused. Just so we're clear. He told me the circumstances, but not everyone here knows your background. That's yours to share or not, as you see fit. James appreciated the discretion. Thank you. I'm still figuring out how much of my story is relevant to the work. All of it is relevant, she said simply, but that doesn't mean all of it needs to be public. After she left, James remained at his desk, reviewing notes from the day. The foundation's annual budget was over $50 million, a staggering sum compared to the loose change he'd sometimes begged for to buy a cup of coffee. Yet, even with those resources, the problems they were addressing seemed insurmountable in scale. The city had over 9,000 people experiencing homelessness on any given night. The Reed Foundation's housing initiative served fewer than 500 annually. Their education grants reached 12 schools out of hundreds in need. Their workforce program trained 200 people a year in a city where thousands were unemployed or underemployed. It was a start, but nowhere near enough. As James finally packed up to leave, he noticed a framed quote on the wall that he'd missed earlier. It was attributed to Alexander Reed. Philanthropy without accountability is just vanity, Measure what matters, not what flatters. The words stayed with him as he rode the elevator down to his apartment. Reed was clearly a complex man, ruthless in business by all accounts, yet genuinely committed to effective philanthropy. The question remained, what did he really want from James? Was he truly seeking honest feedback to improve the foundation's impact? Or was James himself some kind of experiment, a living case study in rehabilitation? That night, as James prepared a simple dinner in his new kitchen, his thoughts kept returning to the people he'd left behind on the streets. Mike, the Vietnam veteran who taught him which doorways were safest to sleep in. Lucia, the elderly woman who somehow maintained her dignity despite living in her car for over a year. Darnell, barely 20, who'd aged out of foster care with nowhere to go. Where were they tonight? Had they found shelter from the continuing cold snap? Were they hungry? Safe? The contrast between his sudden good fortune and their continuing struggle felt almost unbearable. He'd done nothing to deserve this second chance beyond a single act of kindness that anyone with basic humanity might have offered. As he stood at his apartment window, looking out at the city lights, James made a silent promise to the friends he'd left behind. This opportunity wouldn't be wasted. Whatever Alexander Reed's true motives, James would use this position to advocate for real, practical changes that reflected the harsh realities of life on the streets. Friday couldn't come soon enough. He had questions for Reed and suggestions that wouldn't wait. The remainder of the week passed in a blur of meetings, document reviews, and conversations with Foundation staff. James absorbed information like a sponge, drawing on his architectural training to quickly understand systems and structures. By Thursday, he had compiled a detailed list of observations and recommendations for each program area. Some were simple fixes, changing the hours of service centers to accommodate those working irregular shifts, providing storage lockers so people could attend job interviews without carrying all their possessions, offering transportation vouchers for medical appointments. Others required more fundamental rethinking, creating truly low-barrier entry points to services, addressing the reality that many people experiencing homelessness had pets they wouldn't abandon for shelter, acknowledging that sobriety requirements, while well-intentioned, often prevented those most in need from accessing help. Friday morning, James arrived at Reed's corporate offices in a downtown skyscraper that bore his name. Unlike the Foundation's bright, open spaces, Reed Enterprises occupied 20 floors of sleek, minimalist design in shades of gray, black, and white. The reception area on the 40th floor felt more like an art gallery than an office, with abstract sculptures and a wall of water creating a subtle soundtrack. "Mr. Connor," the receptionist greeted him. "Mr. Reed is ready for you. Please follow me." She led him through a series of corridors to a corner office with views in two directions. Alexander Reed stood looking out over the city, his back to the door. Without turning, he spoke. "Do you know what I see when I look out there, James?" James approached the window cautiously. "What do you see?" "Patterns." Reed turned to face him. "Flows of people, resources, opportunities. Some neighborhoods thrive while others decay. Some people rise while others fall. Most see chaos or coincidence. I see systems that can be understood, predicted, and occasionally redirected." He gestured for James to sit in one of two leather chairs positioned near the window rather than across the desk. Reed took the other chair, creating a less formal dynamic than James had expected. "Tell me about your first week," Reed said, his piercing gaze focused entirely on James. For the next hour, James outlined his observations and recommendations, referring occasionally to notes, but mostly speaking from his direct experience. Reed listened without interruption, his expression revealing nothing. When James finished, Reed remained silent for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. A genuine expression that transformed his usually stern features. "Exactly what I hoped for," he said finally. "Practical, insightful, and unfiltered by conventional nonprofit thinking." "You're not offended by the criticisms?" James asked cautiously. Reed waved a dismissive hand. "Why would I be? I didn't create the foundation to stroke my ego. I created it to solve problems efficiently. If current approaches are insufficient, they should be changed." He stood and moved to his desk, retrieving a folder. "I have a proposition for you, James. In addition to your current role, I'd like you to head a new initiative. We're calling it the Direct Impact Project." He handed James the folder. Inside was a proposal outlining a $10 million pilot program focused exclusively on immediate, practical interventions for single adults experiencing homelessness. Precisely the population James had identified as underserved. This was already in development, James realized, scanning the document. "Yes," Reed acknowledged, "for several months. But it lacked someone with the right perspective to lead it." He returned to his seat. "I didn't hire you on a whim, James. I've been looking for someone like you for some time. Someone with both professional capabilities and lived experience. Your act of kindness simply confirmed what I suspected. You have the character this role requires." James felt a complex mix of emotions: validation that his insights were valued, suspicion about being observed without his knowledge, and excitement about the potential impact of the new program. "Why me?" he asked directly. "There must be others with similar backgrounds who have more experience in nonprofit work." Reed's expression grew more serious. "Because you haven't been institutionalized in nonprofit thinking. You see the problems clearly, without the filter of grant requirements or conventional wisdom. And frankly, because you have nothing to lose by telling me the truth." He leaned forward slightly. "Most people in the foundation world are constrained by career concerns, by relationships they need to maintain. You're free from those constraints. If something doesn't work, I trust you'll say so, regardless of whose idea it was." The logic was sound, if somewhat calculating. But a question still nagged at James. "And if I hadn't given away my coat that night? If you'd observed me acting selfishly instead?" Reed's answer was immediate and matter-of-fact. "Then we wouldn't be having this conversation. I have no interest in rehabilitating people who lack basic humanity. But I have every interest in empowering those who maintain their integrity, even in the most challenging circumstances." He stood, signaling the meeting was nearing its end. "The Direct Impact Project is yours if you want it. Same salary for now, but with a performance bonus structure tied to measurable outcomes. Take the weekend to review the proposal and give me your answer on Monday." As James rose to leave, Reed added one final comment. "This isn't charity, James. It's strategy. I believe you can help make the foundation more effective, which serves my goals. The fact that it also gives you a second chance is a beneficial side effect, not the primary purpose." The blunt assessment was oddly reassuring. Reed wasn't pretending to be a selfless benefactor, just a pragmatic businessman who recognized potential value where others might not look. "I'll have an answer for you on Monday," James promised, tucking the folder under his arm. As he left the imposing Reed Enterprises building and walked back toward his apartment, James felt something he hadn't experienced in years: purpose. Not just the purpose of daily survival that had consumed him on the streets, but a larger sense of direction and meaning. Whatever Alexander Reed's true motives, He had offered James not just a job, but a chance to make a real difference for people still trapped in the nightmare he had so narrowly escaped. The Direct Impact Project could be designed to address the very real gaps James had experienced firsthand. The practical barriers that kept people trapped in homelessness despite their best efforts to escape it. By the time he reached his apartment, James had already begun mentally redesigning parts of the proposal, identifying areas where conventional thinking could be replaced with more practical approaches. He spread the documents across his kitchen table and began making notes, ideas flowing faster than he could capture them. Outside, the city continued its rhythms. People hurrying home for the weekend, others preparing for another night without shelter. But for the first time in years, James felt connected to both worlds in a way that might actually matter. The weekend stretched before him, not as empty time to be endured, but as an opportunity to shape something meaningful. By Monday, he would have not just an answer for Reed, but a vision for what the Direct Impact Project could truly become. Monday morning arrived with clarity, matching James's focused mind. The Direct Impact Project proposal had been completely transformed over the weekend, restructured to address the actual barriers people faced on the streets, not just those that fit neatly into conventional program categories. As James presented his revisions to Reed, he outlined 5 major changes. A barrier removal fund, providing immediate assistance for obstacles to employment or housing. A mobile service center bringing resources directly to homeless encampments. A tiered housing approach beginning with low-barrier shelter options, a work first, heal second model, addressing immediate income needs, a peer support network of formerly homeless individuals serving as navigators. Reed studied James intently after the presentation. You've essentially rewritten the entire project. I have, James acknowledged. The original framework was too institutional. It would miss many who need help most. After a moment of consideration, Reed called in Elaine and Sarah from legal, instructing them to implement James's revisions with an accelerated timeline. He then handed James a business card with his name and new title, Director, Direct Impact Project. Your official appointment begins today, Reed said. This isn't just about building a program. You're testing a hypothesis that someone with your background can bring insights traditional philanthropy has missed. The following weeks saw rapid implementation. The Street Connect bus launched in mid-February, bringing services directly to locations James knew from personal experience. By day's end, they had served 68 individuals, issued 23 ID cards, and enrolled 42 people in the broader project. I've been doing outreach for 7 years, Diane Chen, his operations manager, remarked. I've never seen people engage like this. That's because we removed the barriers first, James explained. We're meeting them where they are, literally and figuratively. By month's end, the project had served over 300 individuals, with 78 successfully placed in employment, housing, or both. In early March, Reed visited James's office with news. The mayor's office has taken notice. They've asked for a presentation at next month's Housing Task Force meeting. This opportunity to influence city policy represented a significant expansion of James's role. Reed added another challenge. There's a fundraising gala next Friday. As project director, your presence is expected. James felt uncomfortable. You want me to be an exhibit? The formerly homeless man made good through foundation generosity? That's not what I'm suggesting, Reed clarified. I want you there as a director, presenting your work with authority. How much of your background you share is entirely your decision. After Reed left, James contemplated these new dimensions of his role. He'd focused entirely on operations, but the political and social components were equally important for the project's success. As he prepared for these new challenges, James reflected on his improbable journey, from fighting for survival to potentially influencing city policy. Whatever Reed's ultimate motives, he had created an opening for something potentially transformative. It was up to James to make the most of this platform, not just for himself, but for all those still struggling where he had so recently been.